If you're educated, you're aware of the problems the world is facing, you have views about that. You stop listening to the street stories. You think everything is a rational, logical decision. Actually, it isn't even for you, but you think everybody else should be. So the solution to these problems is to tell other people why they're wrong and why they should think like you. And that isn't going to work. You've got to find resonance points in people's day-to-day lives, which will allow them to make those dispositional changes.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists, and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political, and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Dave Snowden. Dave is the founder and the chief scientific officer of the Cynefin Company and the founder and director of the Cynefin Centre. His work covers government and industry, looking at complex issues relating to strategy and organisational decision-making. In short, Dave is a complexity scientist, and that's what he joins me today to discuss. We begin with a conversation about complexity, what it is, and how complexity science differs from systems thinking. Dave then explains the main fallacy within North Atlantic, i.e. Western, climate thinking, that we can change the world by deciding what we need to do within a room and deliver it to a planet full of 8 billion people. Dave gets into the nitty-gritty of why this approach obviously doesn't work, explaining that we cannot change people's minds, but we can change their interactions. And it is only through changing their interactions that people will begin to reinterpret their stories. This means that we can create the starting conditions for societal change, but we can't force it down people's throats with good arguments, emotional pleas, or, and perhaps especially, guilt-laden accusations. And the rest of the episode is more of a conversation about different things that work, that can't work, what we've both seen from being out in the field and working with communities. I challenge some of the things that Dave thinks we need to employ and keep asking more and more questions to get to the bottom of how it is that we establish what to do together, and then how do we get about doing it. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Dave, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
So I've invited you on to demystify, as it were, some of the big terms that float around the polycrisis or the metacrisis or however you want to define it. And I think we should start with possibly the most common, which is complexity, which seems to get used as an excuse or a reason or evidence for a lot of why things go wrong and we can't make sense of them. But it's a hard word to make sense of. So could you start us off there? What is complexity?
Yeah, it's probably worth starting by the sort of classic comparison between complex and complicated, which a lot of people see as synonyms. And a lot of people, particularly in the safety and engineering communities, just see complex as a description for something which is very, very complicated, which it isn't. So the root word for complicated is something which is folded. And something which can be folded could be unfolded and folded again and doesn't change in its nature. The root word for complex is something which is entangled. Everything is entangled with everything else. And it's like, Alicia Chiararo has a wonderful phrase for this. She says a complex system is like bramble bushes in a thicket. And anybody who walks a lot knows that. You can't pull one branch without something else hitting you. So I think the key thing, 2 or 3 things to understand about complex systems. First of all, complexity is a science. It's not a way of thinking, first. And there's a big difference between systems thinking and complexity science, and probably the clue is in the second word.
Mm-hmm.
And complexity science originates in mathematics, in biology, in chemistry and physics. It doesn't, and it has a much more complex theory of information than systems thinking, which goes back to Shannon and Ashby, comes in with computers and everything else, sort of data set. So, for example, in human systems, we pick a lot of signals from multiple sources. Pheromones help determine whether we trust somebody or not. It's not simply a transactional type relationship. So a complex system is one, in a human complex system, is one where everything is entangled with everything else. The only thing you know with absolute certainty is that anything you do will have unintended consequences. And that's one key principle. The second is the principle of emergence, which is used by lots of disciplines, but has a very specific meaning in complexity. It's not that the properties of the whole are greater than the properties of the parts. That's a sort of mechanistic way of describing it. It's as all of these things interact with other things, properties emerge from the interaction, which can't be interpreted or forecast from the properties of the things which were interacting, and deliberately avoiding the word parts. A complex system has emergence. That means that I can inherently not tell you what the future will hold. Basically, the one thing we know with absolute certainty about complexity is that whatever happens will not be what I forecast. Now, at a macro level, doesn't mean that we can't, for example, forecast the impact of climate change. Yeah. But human reaction to that, that's a whole different kettle of fish, because you've got lots of human actors, you've got lots of variation in the system, and that's one of the areas we work. So unintended consequences is one, and emergent properties is a second. The other is that there is actually a science to all of this. And a lot of people use complexity as an excuse. They say it's complex, therefore we can't determine the future. Well, no, you can't. But you can understand the present. And you can understand what will not happen in the future. And you can understand what is more likely to happen in the future. And this is probably the most important thing for this podcast. Once you've mapped what the present is, you can start to try and influence it so it's more likely to develop in favorable directions. But what you can't do is decide what it should be.
What do you mean by decide what it should be?
So one of the ways that you see this, and sorry, I'm getting quite angry about some of this these days, the whole body of moves, for example, on how we handle, and I don't buy meta-crisis, it's a polycrisis. The one ways we handle this is to change how everybody thinks. Well, that isn't going to make any difference. Gathering 8,000 middle-class people together to have a conversation how the world would be better if everybody thought the way they do isn't going to change the world.
But that isn't actually changing how everyone thinks. Sorry to interrupt, but that's a focus group or a conference. That's not.
That's my point. What it's doing, it's stating how things should be.
Okay.
And then it's trying to close the gap. It's saying if only everybody thought like this, the world would be a better place. First of all, that's not going to make any difference. And secondly, it's a form of what Homer called lotus eating. It's a withdrawal. Now with comfortable people who are comfortable like you are, and therefore you can feel safe.
Yeah.
And I said this at a conference recently in Scandinavia. You couldn't say any of these things if you went onto the streets of the town outside. And until you can have this conversation on the streets of people's day-to-day lives, you're not going to change the way that people think about the world. You've got to change what's called the substrate, the dispositional state of the population. And that doesn't happen by people deciding how other people should think, even if they're right. I'm not trying to say whether they're right or wrong, but it's not the way you achieve change. It's an example with the growth of populism. And I've just come back from Washington. I'm going back there in a couple of weeks' time. I've been doing work in Germany lately. The reality is, if you're educated, you're aware of the problems the world is facing, you have views about that. You stop listening to the street stories. You think everything is a rational, logical decision. Actually, it isn't even for you, but you think everybody else should be. So the solution to these problems is to tell other people why they're wrong and why they should think like you. And that isn't going to work. You've got to find resonance points in people's day-to-day lives, which will allow them to make those dispositional changes.
Who exactly are we talking about here? Because it
Populations
seems
at scale.
okay. Well, but I have seen people sort of attack, if you will, this problem of the world and the state of the world, and not going down the route that you're saying. And admittedly, they're very often not from the West, not white, and not privileged, have very few resources to their name, and they take very, very different routes when it comes to actually sort of managing problems, if you will, and envisioning what could be. And the thing that I always found really interesting is that, contrary to the tendency of Brits in this space or Americans in this space, the people I've been working with in Latin America focus on their space, not the whole country, not the whole world. They think about what do we want to make in our corner of the world.
And that's precisely the point I'm making. Yeah, although not directly so much. So I've done a lot of work with indigenous communities around the world over the years, all right? They're deeply scientific. They just don't use North Atlantic scientific language. I don't use Western, it's North Atlantic. We need to be more specific. And they deal with day-to-day pragmatic issues or problems. Yeah. And that's my point about the dispositional state. Yeah, if we're trying to deal with climate change as a macro problem, yes, it is a macro problem. But until we make it a micro problem, until people start to change at a micro level, the positions aren't going to be able us to make the big changes anyway. I wrote a blog post on this some time ago called Little Acorns, which was about small sacrifices. Until people realize the implication of climate change for their village pond, they won't support politicians who want to make sacrifices at the local level. And a lot of our work is, how do we understand that micro dispositional state, the street stories, the stories of the school gate, the stories of the pub after work, because that's where change will happen. It won't change in privileged people talking about change. That has a different role.
Do you think that there's a generational difference? Because the examples that you just gave, the pub, the school gates, the water cooler, these are physical interactions. Whereas we have a whole generation now of children, teenagers and young adults who do the vast majority of their interactions online now with one another.
And that is a major problem, and I think there's ways around that. But the major problem is that if you limit your communication to text, then you are getting rid of 95% of human sensory. And also, that's the point. I mean, this is my long-term statement about AI. The danger isn't that AI will exceed us in intelligence, but we're dumbing down our own capability. Yeah, to the point where it can. We're meeting it halfway. So one of the ways, if you want to do this, you've got to get people back in. We're talking about climate change. People have got to feel the country, not as a text-based transmission, but as something which is real to them in their day-to-day lives. Yeah, and I think that is a problem for us at the moment.
And yet I'm also thinking of how Israel's slaughter in Gaza has galvanized and radicalized a huge number of young people around the world, no matter their creed. And that's not because they're there, but that's because they've seen it and they've been able to talk about it together and in that way experience it together. So how do we fit that into this? And
when they get on the streets and when they protest about it and when they go and try and do something, I grew up in liberation theology, right? That's my background. And that's a sort of similar context. So yes, you can use electronic forms of communication. You can pass messages around, whether it's the newspapers, whether it's television, whether it's social media. The problem is increasingly you can't trust what comes out of social media. And that's going to become even more so as we go downstream. And so in the general population, it's kind of like, well, so what? Yeah, it's very easy to create fraudulent videos, etc. Trust goes down, which trust is very much based on human interaction. You can't have trust in a third-party social media type environment. Although if people do, that's quite dangerous. So I think, let me give an illustration of some of the work we're trying to do on this.
Sorry. I'm going to have to pause you because you haven't quite answered my question, which is that, is there not a generational difference? We are seeing young people interact differently online. When young people now search, for example, about something, they're not going to Google like my generation. They're going to TikTok to see what their peers can explain about a thing.
And
so it does seem that there's a pretty high level of trust in that amongst young people.
I'd be cautious about calling it trust. But yes, if that's where they go for communication, then that's where they find themselves most comfortable. And feeling most comfortable is not the same thing as trust, I don't think.
Sure.
And what I'm pointing out is that is a real problem, because it's very easy to manipulate them in a TikTok environment, whereas it isn't easy to manipulate people if they have the day-to-day encounters. So, for example, if you want to counter populism, you've got to increase empathy between people who in a TikTok environment will think they should hate them.
Yes. Yeah, I follow that and I agree with that. I am also thinking though about, the island that we both hail from the United Kingdom, being swept up in right-wing populist rhetoric on the streets now, including these protests, no doubt of which have been exacerbated, if you will, by the kind of messaging that can abound on the internet, but have also, first of all, been flamed by the lungs of communication that have existed for a long time, our newspapers.
So they're more balanced than what you actually see on social media. I mean, if you look at what happened, I was looking at some of the conspiracy theories on the stabbing on the train yesterday. And people they're still running with the fact that 2 people are arrested. They haven't really, they're refusing to accept the fact one person wasn't. So then it becomes 2 people couldn't come. It must be a conspiracy, bang, bang, bang. And I think that's the problem we're having with internet communication. The speed of communication and the speed of interaction is very, very fast. Now, there's a good way of illustrating. It's a friend of mine in the Canadian Mounties said this years ago. He said it used to be that every village had an idiot and it didn't matter because people knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots have banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy. And I can get more sophisticated. This is delusion epistemology. So I tell a story, I listen to stories I like. Those stories gradually accumulate to the point where they become what's called an assemblage, which has material reality. Then I can't escape from those stories. This is called territorialization, again, a big area of our work. So if the populists have territorialized social media, which they have, then it's almost impossible for people to escape from those assemblages, from those territories. And that's a big problem for us. Again, let me give in illustrations. And this is kind of like the big project we're involved in at the moment. We've been specializing in using children as ethnographers through schools and sports clubs.
And what is an ethnographer?
Somebody who goes into the community and observes it and asks questions. Right. But rather than having somebody from outside do that, and it's probably one of the only valid forms of research, actually, in terms of it reduces bias. But it requires normally in anthropology, a decade of deep immersion before you can do it properly. So the thing we said is, why not make young people from the community the ethnographers to their own conditions? Right? So young people asking questions of older people from school is much more effective than somebody coming in from outside or from polling or a focus group. So we use children at scale. They can gather stories every week. We can then look at patterns in those stories algorithmically. And by the way, the key thing we do is people interpret their own story. It is not interpreted by an algorithm or by an expert. And that's called epistemic justice. The right to interpret your own experience. We can then look at patterns in those stories which represent a highly local but common problem between people from different political backgrounds. And we can algorithmically allocate small funding to them if they work together on that problem. So what we're looking to do is to increase the personal and the physical empathy between people, not by talking about the bigger problem, but by changing the way they interact at a hyperlocal level. And that's pure complexity theory. If you want to change something, you change interactions, you try and change the people. Now that's based on work I did way back in the 1970s. I was only part of the team on this because I was in my early 20s. And we were looking at peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland at the height of the Troubles. And there were 2 approaches to this. One was Coromila, which would get everybody together in a big room and everybody agree that by the end of the workshop, everybody would agree they're going to be nice to each other. This was wonderfully satirized in episode 1 of series 2 of Derry Girls, all right, where the Catholic girls are forced into a peace and reconciliation process with the Protestant boys. It ends up with a pitched battle over a misunderstanding. It's a brilliant episode. We took a different approach. We took 2 Catholics and 1 Protestant or vice versa, and we dumped them into the slums of Latin America for 3 months.
Mm.
And they discovered pretty fast they had more in common than they realized. And they talked about their differences in the context of working together without facilitation. This is work we've been trying to carry over. We carried it over already into refugees, for example, in Sweden, but also into climate change. If I've talked about with Tyson about creating a peace and reconciliation process between people and the planet, is basically creating hyperlocal interactions between people and things outside of the ideological context, because that will change basically the substrate, the underlying attitudes. So if people start to make sacrifices consistently at a local level, it will enable politicians to make sacrifices at a national level. But until people see the need for that sacrifice at scale, politicians won't do it, and the populists will gain traction.
Sorry, that seems a bit of a jump for me. Why just because people are making sacrifices that politicians then will?
Oh, because if the people who vote for them are actually making small sacrifices around the environment in their local communities, they've started to understand the need for sacrifice. A wonderful book by Terry Eagleton on this, by the way, called Radical Sacrifice. Because in order to deal with the polycrisis, people are going to have to sacrifice a lot of the things that they currently value.
No, I understand that. Just to me, it seems to erase the corporate capture that we know happens in government, the affiliation between politicians and industry, and certainly between politics and economics.
Yep. Who gets? I mean, okay. Yeah, Europe at the moment is probably the only bastion of democracy still around, and we're not very good. I can count some exceptions, but all that I'm talking about here is about the model of democracy we normally talk about is a model of democracy which evolved in Britain, post-Enlightenment. That's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's the dominant one. That's not the only form of doing democracy.
No, of course.
Or of engagement at scale. And there are different ways around the world in terms of you do it. But if you've got a vote every 4 years, which is where with the exception of China, most of the polluting nations come from, politicians will not do things that actually basically involve sacrifice unless people are prepared to vote for it. That's the key principle.
I understand that. I just think that I do think it's more complex than that, given that essentially governments get their power from state power. They represent state power. State power gets their actual power from energy-dense fuels. Energy-dense fuels are sourced by having relationships with corporations or other big states. And so I don't think that this is an ideological problem of if they sacrifice, then we will sacrifice, or vice versa.
It's not the total, but equally, it's equally not the case that it's all down to corporate greed and corporate capture.
No, but I'm not saying it's about corporate greed or corporate capture. I'm talking about the mechanisms by which a nation state runs, which is that it needs an energy input and a material input.
It is. Populists wouldn't be taken over.
Why not?
Because populists rely on people voting for them independently of that capital. It's not necessarily in capital's interest for populists to take over.
Well,
we could go down a rat hole on this.
Well, no, but hang on. I disagree. I think it is vastly with it. Well, I suppose it depends. But I think that there's been 2 capital orders created essentially with the rise of people like Donald Trump, whereby there's an exclusive capitalist class and then the original capitalist class. And so for Trump and his cronies, and this is how crony capitalism works around the world, it's very, very beneficial to them that he get in, because he will be funneling more money to them.
Not so much for traditional capital, which is an interesting contrast, and that's something we can exploit. But Trump couldn't get in if he didn't get voted for by effectively people on the street. And what populists have always done, yes, they do. Hitler did the same. Lots of people did the same.
Yeah.
The point is that as long as if people, it's the classic error, and this is, I don't mean it quite the way I'm going to say it.
Okay.
If you end up with a distressed white working class male, you've got to...
Yes.
Because that's what the populists will exploit.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. And that's what Trump did.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my point about you have to change the way the thing works at a local level so that those people aren't in isolation. They're not feeling distressed, all right? They understand the problem in ways that they can understand it. That's my point about the village pond. The language of discourse has got to change from the language of the elite talking about meta-crises into the language of people talking about their local environment, the things that matter to them, the things that work. And that's the kind of point I'm making. Until that changes, populists will be able to get a grip. I think the other thing that there's, I'll give my pet problem at the moment. At the moment, one of the problems we've got is those people who are aware of the climate crisis, and regrettably it's not the percentage it needs to be, are trying to solve the big problem. Now, there's lots of things we could do on a contingency basis. So, for example, former chief scientist in the UK at Cambridge has done the work on what it would, the basic science behind refreezing the poles. Is there an engineering problem? It's not a science problem.
Yeah.
I've been trying to persuade people in two of the big oil companies to let their engineers spend time on that.
Interesting.
Because actually that would give us more time. And at the moment, what we're doing is this is really strong Manichaean tendency in North Atlantic thinking, is we're demonizing people who need to be part of the problem. I'm no fan of big oil, but big oil has got to be part of the solution as well as part of the problem.
But I have to say, I agree. I think we should be taking money off of them, taking expertise off of them, inviting them to the table, because they are far too big and powerful to ignore. I'm curious, though, about this. Essentially, what you're talking about is geoengineering with refreezing the poles. You said that with complexity science, essentially what will happen is always something that you cannot forecast.
Consequence. Yeah, but the problem we got at the moment is we're beyond the point in the planet tipping points where we can avoid geo-engineering. The problem is who does it. The thing I'm really scared about is one of those hyper-rich people just decides to do it on their own accord without control. Musk can do it tomorrow.
But how do we know what would happen? How do we know that refreezing the poles would be a good thing and not that it would further tip some other point of Earth's systems out of balance?
It might tip something else. We don't know, but we've got to do something.
Ooh.
So, but there are some things which are really high risk in terms of probability. So, for example, scattering aluminium in the sky, which they say Musk could do tomorrow if he fancied, that's really high risk.
Yeah.
Refreezing the poles is a gradual change. And again, what complexity teaches you, I call this the Frozen 2 strategy.
Okay.
Which is what you're getting across. Have you watched Frozen 2 yet?
Oh, you mean the cartoon? No, I haven't seen
the movie.
No.
Complexity movie. It's actually a really good environmental movie, is Frozen 2 as well. But in the middle of it, the real heroine of the series is the young sister without the magic, sings all I can do is do the next right. That's complexity science. So what you want to do is identify what Stu Kaufman called the adjacent possibles. Where are the things we can go to which might improve things, move there and look again. So what you don't want on geoengineering is something which is a massive one-time magic solution intervention because the unintended consequence would be massive. You want to start doing geo-engineering which changes the environment. Let's give you another. Focusing on replaceable batteries is more likely to get the oil companies on board than focusing on traditional batteries.
Why?
Because then effectively they can sell the battery replacements like they sell fuel.
Okay.
If I can drive into a garage and a machine replaces the battery in my car and replaces it with another, you've got a better economic model.
Right, gotcha.
And this is the thing we're not thinking about because we're starting off with these idealistic positions about where we should be. We're not saying not only where are we, but where is everybody else and where are their adjacent possibles. So you have to identify for corporate greed, what are their adjacent possibles, what are their fears, what are their concerns. You've got to do it for people in the streets worried about whether they can feed their children or not, who do not want to pay the amount of money they've got to pay for power and therefore won't accept the compromise.
I completely agree with your pragmatism and your messaging around all of this. The thing that I worry about, say, with regards to geoengineering is that I'm not sure what buying us more time would achieve apart from more corporate looting of the planet, because it's been how many years now of these COP conferences? At least 30 years. It was the Kyoto Protocol in the 90s. It's only gotten worse. There's been more extraction, more pollution, more waste. And so there's no reason, I think, to believe that buying an extra 5 years would then be the 5 years in which suddenly the world turns around and does something.
Not if we carry on the way we're carrying on. I mean, I said at the time of the Paris Accord, this is the wrong way to go forward. Because we're not making it a problem for people, we're making it a problem for them at their big meeting.
So how would refreezing the ice caps make it a problem?
And given it as what it would do, it would give us some more time, but it starts to move into this. And you say, the argument I'm making to two of the big oil companies, because they have difficulty in retaining staff because of what they do, is we'll let them spend, 1 day a week on this environmental project, which is for your benefit anyway. You've got to find out where people are and make these small increments from where they are next. The Paris Agreement, all of those international agreements, really had never meant anything anyway. With really since the end of the First World War, those were the last ones to be very effective. Led by Lord George. So fundamentally, what international agreements do is it means people say, well, it's their problem, it's not my problem. You've got to make it everybody's problem at scale, including the people who work for those big companies. And I'll tell you now, from work I've done, people who work for oil companies do worry about it. That's an angle, that's a leverage point. And as long as you demonize them, the oil companies will go in. There's a big difference between European management in oil companies and American management in oil companies. Huge difference in terms of their attitude. So again, if you want to change things, you start with where things are and you move to the next station. That means you've got to map that at scale. And that's what we're doing with children. And children are very effective at this, by the way. Young children, 16, 18, the TikTok generation, if you want to put it. They can engage in this. If you don't know on brain plasticity, the human brain tends to lock down early 20s female, mid-20s male. You're working with people who are much more open, and we use a thing called the transgenerational pair.
What's that?
So we use, brain plasticity sort of locks down 20s, right? It opens up 40s, 50s. So there's a thing I call the grandparent syndrome, in that grandparents will tell things to grandchildren and vice versa that neither will tell to the middle generation. And for the vast majority of our history, grandparents have been the primary child carers and the primary teachers. So there's an evolutionary argument on this. And it's also called young driver syndrome, in that young drivers see things that experienced drivers don't. So, for example, we've done this in Wales, we've done it elsewhere. You put teenagers together with people from their grandparents' generation, together with somebody from the local authority who can make things happen. And you throw those trios at solving problems in the community, right? Rather than have a grand plan decided by government after 3 years of research and a lot of publicity. So you generate lots of micro changes at scale based on local knowledge, rather than trying to generate the big issue. But then you're building those bridges, you're building those connections, you're building that interaction. And you'll be building people's interaction with the planet itself. You're moving away from a purely virtual exchange to a physical exchange.
Okay, so is a lot of your work essentially around then what us as the middle class talky people are doing wrong, why it won't change anything, and why all of this has to come from the ground up, essentially?
In the middle class talky this, and I do a lot of it. I've got no problem with it. It's a very good thing to do, but it's inadequate. To use Lincoln's phrase, it's inadequate to the stormy present. Huge amount of our work is to remove middle class expertise from the situation and let the expertise grow bottom up. And to learn to live with where people are rather than where you would like them to. That's a key principle. And if you look at what happened with the populist elections, I had a major argument on this in the States a few years ago. It got backed up by the Georgia Democrats, because they delivered Georgia for by going on the street and talking with people, not by trying to outcompete in social media. And sorry about this, but social media is controlled by the big bad guys, not by the good guys. And don't assume it won't be used that way. So again, it's change the dynamics, right? Get the system to reveal what's possible. Then it's called a micro nudge. I mean, nudge economics has been mostly discredited if you look at the literature. But micro nudge is very different. It's getting people to do small things in the present, which shift things in the right direction. And once you get a certain scale on that, then the thing starts to rise exponentially.
Exponentially?
It's called the button threading problem. Once you get a certain amount of interaction change, the interaction magnifies very quickly. It works against us as well as for us if you look at the speed of the growth of populism. That's an example of that phenomenon. So we need to understand the science of that and work with it. And that's But the irony on this, right, is, and in a meeting tomorrow about it as it happens, is you can get 5 or 10 million to get a lot of people together to talk about how things should be. But you can't get 5 or 10 million to build something which will work worldwide at a micro level, because people can't see the benefit. They're so used to the talking therapy.
Yeah. Also, on that though, it's that you cannot build a model that can be scaled out worldwide, because every single locale will be different and people will be different and they will have different needs. And this is slightly what concerns me about the leftist literature coming out of the academy right now, looking at,
Absolutely.
Yeah. And it's like a one
And
size
sorry,
fits
I was
all.
I was part of that in the 70s, all right? I mean, I used to cross the wall in Berlin every week, 8 weeks, until the Stasi finally picked me up, all right? And you'd have ferocious arguments in beer kellers on the Kudamm, which was a frontier street in those days, about which type of Marxist were you. We even had songs about it. And that is a problem.
Actually, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the fact that there's a one-size-fits-all approach coming out now from certain, and essentially modeling, if you let me finish, modeling how we could live sustainably, 10 billion people on the planet or 15 billion people on the planet. And this is what every single person will have access to. And whilst it's good to show that we have adequate resources, I think it's very North Atlantic to presume that everyone will have the exact same needs as dictated from this side of the world.
And that was my point. In the 70s, we were having a fight about whose view of what that future should be. And you can see the same now.
Right.
And the reality is situations will be very different. Education is more or less a universal, which is why we go through schools. Sports clubs are really good because they get to people other systems won't. And to start to find the solutions which will work, then just use small investments to magnify. And again, that's a pure complexity science approach until the dispositional system changes. What are called pervert assemblies, perversion in the Lacanian sense, or in the sexual sense. Sorry, I just thought I'd make that clear. Is that basically pervert assemblies will dominate because the energy cost of staying in that assembly is less than the energy cost of escape.
And what is can you define that in a Lacanian sense?
Okay. Yeah, so the famous thing on there was a good example, right? A friend of mine who did the Lacanian Society gave an example on this. You remember that conservative politician who sued the Guardian for libel on the last day of the trial? A receipt was found in Paris which proved he'd lied all the way through the trial, and he went to prison. And my friend phoned me up after that, and she said, I guarantee you within the next year that he will find God.
Oh, interesting.
Because she said it's a perverse response. The only reason for him to go to prison is God selected him to go and convert prisoners. And she was absolutely right. That's the type of perversion where whatever happens gets reinterpreted to fit what you actually need. Again, this is what Deleuze talks about territorialization, and our work is to say that Deleuzian assemblages are the same things as what's called a strange attractor, which is a pattern which forms, which is difficult to escape. Now, one of the ways you deterritorialize is to reduce the granularity. So small things can reassemble in novel ways, big things can't reassemble. One of the ways you rid of prejudice is to actually increase interaction at a local level between people from different backgrounds.
Yes.
I finely grained solutions are the way you deterritorialize, and that's what we're doing with the Children Project.
Have you heard
local patterns?
Have you heard of Ambition Lawrence Western?
Don't think so.
So it's an amazing project, and I'd encourage you to look into it because it's doing everything that you're saying. It's one of the most deprived areas in the UK, just outside of Bristol. And they lost everything in a really short period of time. They lost the local supermarket, they lost the local library, everything. And they realized that they were going to have to do something about this themselves, essentially, rather than be waiting to be saved. And so a small group of them got together in the pub and then went and knocked on every single door in the neighborhood and asked 3 questions. What do you like about Lawrence Western? What don't you like? And what do you think could be better? And from there, they made a plan for the neighborhood. And they have just done the right thing at every step by doing these sort of mass surveys. And they now own the largest on-land wind turbine in the UK. They've got a supermarket back in town at really, really cheap prices. They are re-insulating their homes. I believe they're building another 3,000 new energy-efficient homes for low-income households in the area. It's extraordinary, and they have done it all themselves just by talking to each other.
I mean, that's really powerful. You can see the same thing with, say, with the cooperative movement in Northern Spain. The context stimulates people to do things differently. Then it becomes its own assembly. But the big mistake people make, and it's a North Atlantic mistake, is to assume they can replicate the outcome of an immersion process rather than the stunting conditions.
Okay, go on.
And that's the point. So what they did in Bristol, you can't necessarily do somewhere else. Again, what we're trying to do, and you can't do it with curation either. This is a massive problem with people's use of narrative. The experts want to curate them. In Bristol, they curated their own stories. That's critical. That's called epistemic justice. To do this at scale around the world, that's what we're working on. Because there are lots of examples where around the world where communities have done something and made a difference. But there aren't enough of them to really change the overall state. And so what we're trying to say is, how do you create conditions in which there will be more and more cases like the Bristol cases? Because they arise because you've created the right infrastructure, the right substrate. One key principle in complexity is that people respond. A complex system responds to things which are proximate, not things which are different. Let me give you two examples. People actually did lockdown during COVID because the threat was proximate. But they won't accept a lesser sacrifice for climate change because the threat is distant. So people don't respond to things which are distant, they respond to things which are immediate. And those are where the cases come from. So that's a problem. If you look at bee swarming, this is the latest thing we've been working on, then interestingly, insect behavior optimization happens and novel solutions are found because they don't have a directed intelligence. So when the bees' temperature reaches a certain level in the hive, the bees will hatch out a new queen, they'll form a swarm. All the individual bees go and try and find a location. And then they come back to the swarm and they do what's called the waggle dance, which is a figure of 8 dance on the swarm, in which the angle of the plane of the dance to the sun says where the location is. And the intensity of dance says actually how good it is.
Oh, wow.
And some bees at random disrupt the dance of other bees, which, if you know your statistics, is really important. Then 2 or 3 days afterwards, the whole swarm goes to a new location. It's always the best of all the ones that they've actually investigated. Fail. That's actually been researched. Now, we're now working on that, and we're hoping to do an experiment in a city before too much long. So we can present a problem to thousands or millions of people. We can get them all to interpret that problem, not in terms of solution. Because what you're trying to understand is people's attitudes and beliefs about how they should be, not the specific solution. We can then go through multiple iterations, equivalent to the waggle dance, until we know what consensus is possible and we know what outlier opinion. We reckon we can do it in 2 or 3. Now, that's a radically different approach to things like citizen assemblies, because it allows things to move very quickly so that you can actually move to reinforce things which are moving in the right direction. And those are the sort of things we're going to have to start thinking about now, because we need much faster feedback loops and less facilitation.
But what will the outcomes of that be? If you're asking 1 million people in a city, what is it to do? Is it to figure out what the city needs?
No, it's to figure out people's attitudes and beliefs and what they value and what they don't. So I'll give you an illustration of a failed project. So when Obama got elected to the White House, I got dragged in. I worked with quite a few interesting people in Washington, both Democrat and Republican, and they're all evil because you all end up evil when you're that level of government. So I got hiked in, and Obama had this bright idea by which he would go to the whole population of the United States and they would all come up with ideas and the best would be funded. And we said, that's a disaster waiting to happen. You shouldn't do it.
Why?
Well, they did it, all right. Then they had more ideas than they could fund, so they set up another system to decide which were the best ones on the voters system. Then the lobby industry got hold of that, and they ended up with 90% not getting funded and totally pissed off with the government. And nothing really changed. We had a different approach. Well, why don't we get the schools to gather the stories? Let's look at the attitudes. Then we run initiatives in where we know that they'll be supported by those attitudes, which we know are more likely to succeed, to change things. What you do is you use your limited resource, or the wider thing, if you can actually get people together and you can do something small, you'll get some funding. Is you've got to actually start with those underlying attitudes, beliefs and dispositional states, not with solutions. They're working Wales on this on citizen juries, because people work out from citizen juries. It's better to downvote your competitor than to actually say what is the...
Why?
Because you're more likely to win your project.
Right.
People are canny. Anything explicit will be gained. And look at the way citizen assemblies were used by the British government on climate change. They held them to tick a box, but it doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. I don't understand exactly why that idea of Obama's did fail. Because I'm thinking of a similar example in Taiwan during COVID, in which they set up this alternative government webpage. Actually, it was set up by hackers originally, and then the government decided it was a great idea and did the same. And people could send in ideas about how to manage the pandemic and manage the response to it, essentially. And lots of these ideas were taken up and implemented. And Taiwan came out far ahead of the curve when it came to managing the pandemic.
But that's not the same thing as the Obama thing. So people are coming up with ideas. If your idea gets picked up, you feel good about it. In this case, it was proposing projects which required... That created the problem. Because it meant that there were too many to be actually funded. And what the Taiwan thing is, its ideas at a much lower level of granularity. Is also one of the interesting features of complexity science, all right, which is a biological process called acceptation.
No.
It's critical for anybody in climate change to study this. Dinosaurs' feathers, and we now know that all dinosaurs had feathers, which is cute, and they were very colourful. So they evolved, obviously, for sexual display. The only reason for lots of coloured feathers is sexual display. One type of dinosaur evolved over time, a sort of skin flap under its arms so it could better display its colourful feathers. And when those dinosaurs ran very quickly to escape predators, they started to glide, and that's how we got flight.
Right.
If dinosaurs had thrown themselves off cliffs in the hope of evolving feathers before they hit the ground, it wouldn't work. It is Gould's work. So acceptation is the biological process by which a trait which evolves for one function, under conditions of stress, it doesn't adapt, it accepts for something completely different. Yeah?
Okay.
So the cerebellum at the base of your brain evolved in higher apes to manipulate muscles in fingers. And you can see the reason for that, to better get food. It accepts in humans to manage grammar in human language.
Mm-hmm.
Grammar is far too complex a thing to just evolve in a linear way. It requires this non-linear lateral, it's called radical repurposing in the field guide, which we read.
Mm-hmm.
In technology terms, when somebody realized the significance of a chocolate bar melted in their pocket in 1945, when they were maintaining the magneto of a radar machine, they then put a metal box around the magneto. We got microwave ovens.
Okay.
The huge history of human technology is acceptive, not adaptive.
Mm-hmm.
We know that art either comes before or in parallel with human language in evolutionary terms.
Do we? For sure?
Yeah, from the fossil record. The only argument is, does it come first or not? And I think it comes before language, other people will say afterwards. But it's really part of that early language development. A huge amount of our words are abstract concepts rather than physical things. And we think one of the reasons for that is actually abstraction is the way that you see novel patterns. It also makes you prone to conspiracy theories. It's called abductive logic, if you want to get into philosophy. So what art does is it takes you away from the material world so you see things differently. And you can see that in dance, you can see it in art, music, and everything else. What that does in humans, it makes us hugely adaptive because we see these novel connections. Mm-hmm. One of the things I was talking about recently, which we may start a project on, which we'll call the Swords and Plowshares projects. Biblical phrase, they shall turn their swords into plowshares. So the massive investment of technology into military, we need to make that investment such for technologies which could be used for peace as well as for war. Which
Okay.
actually military doctrine is going towards at the moment anyway.
Is it?
An aircraft carrier for the Ukrainians is a lorry with drones, compared with what it is elsewhere. So military technology is going to this more finely grained level.
Sorry, and how can drones be used for peace as well?
Well, drones are, they're used for farming, low impact
Right.
farming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
What we've got to do is to find ways in which existing technologies can be repurposed to help us on climate change. We haven't got time to invent the primary ones. You can see this in some of the battery development. Getting batteries to the point where you can literally plug them in and out of cars is really close.
Mm-hmm.
But we're not working at scale to say what technologies are we developing which can actually be used in radically different ways, not for what they were purposed. We rely on accidental discovery. Most drug development is based on accidentally noticing side effects.
Mm-hmm.
And we've only recently started to try and capture side effects.
Mm-hmm.
We rely on medical staff to spot the side effects. Some of our work is to get patients to report their own side effects. Yeah. I call this small notices.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to find ways in which people notice anomalies very quickly so that they can repurpose. And I'll give you an example. This was a commercial project. And we were working with one of the big lighting companies. And they wanted to have lights to light gardens. Yeah, that's how people used it. But they actually thought commercially, if people use lights, that they use rocks and flowers as a garden feature, it would be a whole new market. So we gathered stories about people's gardens, take a picture of a garden you like. And the thing we developed a long time ago is called high abstraction metadata, which uses abstract language or symbols. So you don't, unlike a questionnaire, you don't know what the purpose of the interpretation is. That's deliberate. And then we took all of the technologies they had interpreted into the same framework and we matched the metadata structures together and said, why are these consumer stories linked with these technologies? And that stimulated people to think. And it ended up with a product which I'm appalled, to be honest. This plastic rock which changes lurid primary colors based on water flow and human wall proximity. It's totally but it's entirely based on a technology originally designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in a football stadium.
Okay. Okay.
That's working at what we call acceptation at scale. And that's the other big project I think we need to start to work on is how do we find the technologies which we are already capable of, which can be reused for novel purposes. I've been in the Ukraine and going back in February. That's what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like your Bristol case. When human beings get hugely stressed, they get hugely inventive and they find solutions. With climate change, by the time we get stressed enough, it's going to be too late. How do we create those micro stresses and those micro opportunities now, I think, is key.
That's a very sort of grim picture of human advancement. I don't really want to use that term, or progress, but this idea that it's under stress, that we come up with ways to.
Regrettably, it's true. We invent more things during wartime than we do during peacetime. When we let people go across the Atlantic and accepted 80% casualty rates, people discovered things they didn't do before. So what we're saying is that this, I'm a Catholic, all right? So to give up hope is a mortal sin, but it doesn't require me to be optimistic. And I think what we need in the environmental movement is a lot less of this wild optimism and these ideological approaches and far more deep pragmatism about working with how things are. And the human condition is such. We respond to proximity. We invent more under stress. That's what we are as a species. So let's work with it rather than try and pretend it's not the case.
I agree with you about the wild optimism. I have to say, though, some of the things that you've said to me sound like wild optimism, like with regards to co-opting military technologies, or even the idea of replaceable batteries being the way in which we get the oil companies on board. Because when I speak to geologists, they say, well, we just don't have enough resources essentially to ensure that everybody gets a car, to replace the car industry with electric cars. We are going to have to look to massively reduce the amount of materials that we're consuming and the energy that we're consuming to do it with.
So I'm giving that as an example, right? And that's my point about adaptation. We're going to have to find completely novel ways of doing things. ironically, one of the things that big tech is doing by driving these massive technology farms, the huge energy things at massive cost, is we're finding new ways to provide energy a lot cheaper. Yeah, and that is, the cost of that is very high, but there's some good stuff coming out of it, which we need to recognize. And my point is this, that you can't start the Enlightenment approach, and that's the problem. It's infectoplantic thinking. If only everybody had the right education and the right attitude, they would make the right decisions. And if only we have a rational principle. It's not like that. We actually need to do is to find things we're already very good at and find new ways to use them. And that includes social processes. And we need more ideas to spread horizontally. So, for example, in some of the work we've done in using chunk as capture, an idea about a farming innovation in Colombia can move horizontally to Africa without the need for mediation by a development agent. And we're using technology for entertainment or to connect people in perverted ways, because that's what technology does. It doesn't connect people in good ways. It concentrates these rankings of evil, buckets. We're not using it to actually connect or distribute things on a horizontal basis. I'm hopeful because there are new ways of doing things. I'm pessimistic because guys who couldn't care less about the planet are doing what they want to do, and the guys who really care want everybody to be like them before change will happen.
So how would you sum up, Dave? Why is the world in crisis?
Because we are what we are as a species, because things grew at the pace they did, and I'm not idealistic about indigenous communities, because if they got power before, they'd just be the same as us, all right? Human beings, there is one thing I say, this is the famous recent work on anthropology which came out, is the evidence is growing that human beings competed in summer and cooperated in winter.
I've heard that in certain places around the world, not all places, because not all places have summer and winter, obviously.
But it gives us a model, all right? So the reason for monument building is fundamentally you don't get people to work together when they're conflicting, because you tell them and have a workshop and tell them how they should be nice to each other. You could make them move massive bloody stones around in the field. That's what we're building on these concepts. Like if you get people to work together on something, then they will see the other person as a human being. I think you could almost say that capitalism works in summer and socialism works in winter. To mistake it, winter is coming. Well, it does. If you've got infinitely available resource and no impact, then you can have competition. That's how we grew.
But that's not
the world that we live in. So we need the winter thing, which is cooperation. And cooperation will come by small groups of people working together on things which they already agree are important, rather than things that the middle class elite think are important.
Okay. Dave, this has been very interesting. My final question for you is, who would you like to platform?
Oh, I think there's a couple of people I've looked at. One is Alicia Gerardo.
No.
She's very good. The other is, to be honest, 2 or 3 members of my team, because they do most of this work. They're young women in their 30s, PhDs and master's degrees in anthropology. They're deeply rooted in practice and they've got sound theories. Getting 2 or 3 of them on together would be interesting.
Okay, great. We'll look into that. Dave, thank you very much for your time today. This was great. If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.